The 19th century ended with a lie of architecture. Across the Atlantic, London, Paris, and Rome were ancient cities of stone, their buildings having stood for centuries, their heights constrained by the sheer, terrifying limits of gravity. In a traditional European-style building, every floor piled more weight onto the walls below it. Go too high, and the walls at the base would have to be impossibly thick, squeezing out the light and the rentable space. It was a centuries-old physical law, an invisible ceiling that limited ambition. New York in 1880 inherited this limitation. The city was a grid of 5- and 6-story brownstones in commercial blocks, dense and thriving, but fundamentally horizontal. Its economic engine was jammed against the limits of its own infrastructure. Something had to change, and that change didn't begin with a grand architectural vision. It began with 3 separate revolutionary necessities. The first was a solution for movement. A 12th-story building was technically possible with old methods, but few wanted to live or work in it. The upper floors were considered the least desirable, the least valuable, the domain of pigeons and servants. This changed in 1853, not in New York, but at the Crystal Palace exhibition in Manhattan. A mechanic named Elisha Otis stood on a simple wooden platform, which was then hoisted 50 feet into the air. Suddenly, ropes were deliberately cut. The crowd gasped, bracing for a catastrophic crash. But the platform only dropped a few inches before a crude, ingenious spring mechanism, the safety brake, engaged with the supporting rails, holding the car fast. "All safe, gentlemen," Otis called out. It was not a new way to go up. It was a new way to not fall down. Otis had removed the inherent mortal fear of mechanical failure. He had invented the safety elevator, and in doing so, he made the upper floors of a building as accessible and therefore as valuable as the ground floor. The monetary ceiling on architecture had just been shattered. The second and most critical revolution was in material science. The old world structure was the load-bearing wall, where the wall was the structure. The new world demanded the skeletal frame, where the structure was hidden. The skyscraper is not a building made of stone. It is a cage made of steel, dressed in a curtain of brick or glass. The breakthrough came with the Bessemer process and the mass production of cheap, high-quality structural steel. Unlike brittle cast iron, steel could withstand both compression, pushing down, and tension, pulling apart, as in a strong wind. In a skeletal building, the exterior walls became mere skins or a curtain wall. They didn't hold up the building, the steel frame did. This meant the building could go higher and the walls could be thinner, allowing for enormous windows that flooded the interiors with light. The third element was unique to Manhattan itself. To hold up a cage of steel weighing tens of thousands of tons, you need an unimaginably stable foundation. Chicago, which pioneered the earliest tall buildings using raft foundations on soft clay, would soon hit an engineering limit. Manhattan had an astonishing secret. Directly beneath the topsoil of the southern end of the island lay the Manhattan Schist, a dense metamorphic rock over 1 billion years old. The island was anchored to a foundation far more stable than human civilization itself. Builders had to drill huge cylindrical steel casings, called caissons, down through the mud and gravel, sometimes 100 feet, using compressed air to keep the water out until they struck the schist. This grueling, dangerous work, performed by immigrant laborers, was the ultimate foundation for the vertical metropolis. The Flatiron Manifesto and the Skyscraper Wars. By the turn of the century, all the pieces were in place: the steel, the safety elevator, and the bedrock. The race was on, but it needed a symbol. It found it at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. Architect Daniel Burnham was tasked with designing a building for a tiny triangular plot of land at the crossroads of the city. He didn't just design a building, he designed a manifesto. The Fuller Building, immediately nicknamed the Flatiron 1902, was not the tallest building in the world at 285 feet, but it was the most famous. It was revolutionary, not just for its steel frame, but for the way its prow sliced through the wind, an elegant ship of commerce pushing through the urban current. The public reaction was electric. People came from across the city to stare at it, betting on the corner whether the strong winds at the intersection would truly topple it. The Flatiron made the skyscraper not just a technical necessity, but an art form, a civic statement. The Flatiron proved the concept, but the next decade saw the true escalation, the Skyscraper War, a fight not against gravity, but against each other. For a brief, glittering moment, the tallest structure in the world belonged to a sewing machine company, the Chrysler Building, 1908. Architect Ernest Flagg delivered a dazzling 47-story, 612-foot tower, an ornate black and gold monument to global commerce. But its reign was short-lived. Across town, the Metropolitan Insurance Company Tower, 1909, inspired by the Campanile in Venice, rose to 700 feet, dwarfing the Singer. It held the title of the world's tallest for 3 years, a beacon-like symbol of corporate longevity. These early behemoths screamed the success and permanence of the companies whose names they bore. The day the sky was taken away. This feverish vertical growth, however, contained a fundamental problem. The buildings were still being built as massive vertical blocks. The ultimate expression of this blockiness was the Equitable Building in Lower Manhattan. 40 stories tall and built right up to its lot lines on all 4 sides, the Equitable was a colossal slab that seemed to defy the sun itself. It cast a 7-acre shadow over the surrounding financial district, plunging nearby streets and businesses into perpetual gloom. The public outcry was immediate and profound. People realized that unchecked vertical growth could, paradoxically, make the city darker and less habitable. This single building prompted New York City's first major civic intervention, the 1916 zoning resolution. This law fundamentally changed the architecture of the city forever. It was simple, yet profound. It mandated that for a building to go higher, it had to step back from the street as it rose, at a defined angle. The higher you wanted to build, the more your structure had to recede from the sidewalk. This single regulation, intended to limit a building's volume and preserve light and air, unintentionally created the distinct, jagged, tapered silhouette that the world now recognizes as the New York skyline, the famous wedding cake shape. The 1916 zoning resolution did not end the height race, it simply gave it a beautiful, dramatic form.
Money, mass, and the machine aesthetic. The 1920s roared, and nowhere louder than in the girders of New York. The 1916 zoning resolution was now the law of the land, and architects embraced its constraints, transforming a legal necessity into a dramatic new aesthetic, Art Deco. Art Deco was the style of the machine age, glamorous, symmetrical, streamlined, and absolutely obsessed with the sense of rising speed and verticality. The post-World War I economic boom filled the coffers of Wall Street and Midtown, fueling an explosion of commercial building. The architects of this decade understood that in New York, size was an advertisement, but height was a declaration of global dominance. And so began the greatest, most intense, and most personal rivalry in architectural history, the three-way Skyscraper War. The battle for the title of world's tallest became a gladiatorial contest between 3 powerful men and their architects. Contender 1, the banker's ego, 40 Wall Street. In 1928, a consortium led by the Bank of Manhattan announced their plan for a colossal tower at 40 Wall Street. They hired architect H. Craig Severance, a man known for aggressive ambition. The initial plans called for 840 feet, enough to reclaim the title for Lower Manhattan. Construction began at a maniacal pace. Severance's goal was simple: get to the top first, no matter the cost. Contender 2, the Automobile King's monument, the Chrysler Building. Midtown was not to be outdone. Walter P. Chrysler, the automotive titan, was determined to build a monument not just to his corporation, but to his own boundless ego. He hired architect William Van Allen, a former partner and now bitter rival of Severance. Chrysler's team watched the progress at 40 Wall Street, and the rivalry became a public obsession. Van Allen's design was pure Art Deco brilliance, a slender tower of stepped terraces and triangular windows crowned with an unbelievable 7-tiered spire. clad in shimmering silver-white stainless steel, the same metal used in Chrysler car hubcaps. The decorative details were astounding. Giant eagles, modeled after the Chrysler hood ornaments, jutting out at the 61st floor. As 40 Wall Street raced towards its announced height, Van Allen and Chrysler executed the greatest architectural sleight of hand in history. They had secretly assembled the 185-foot stainless steel spire inside the core of the building. When 40 Wall Street topped out and celebrated its victory at 927 feet, the celebration was cut short. On October 23, 1929, the massive Chrysler spire was hoisted through the roof and bolted into place in a matter of 90 minutes. The Chrysler Building stood 1,046 feet tall, suddenly and dramatically claiming the title of the world's tallest building. It was a victory of dazzling speed and spectacular aesthetic. Contender 3, the ultimate American will, the Empire State Building. Walter Chrysler's victory was to last only 11 months. The moment Chrysler's plan was revealed, a consortium led by former New York Governor Al Smith and financier John J. Roscoe, a former GM executive, decided they had to beat both of them. Their architect, William Lamb, was given the simplest mandate: build the world's tallest building. Smith and Roscoe chose the former Waldorf Astoria hotel site and began construction immediately. While the Chrysler Building was a masterpiece of decoration, the Empire State Building, 1931, was a masterpiece of efficiency and sheer scale. The pace was relentless. Working 6 days a week, the builders erected the steel frame at an unprecedented rate of 4.5 stories every week. The structure became a symbol of raw, unyielding American industrial power. The workers, primarily Irish, Italian, and the famously fearless Mohawk Skywalkers from Canada, moved across the beams hundreds of feet above Fifth Avenue with little to no safety equipment, tossing red-hot rivets to each other as if playing catch. Their courage and skill were the human engine of the structure. On May 1, 1931, the Empire State Building was completed. It rose to an astonishing 1,250 feet, 102 stories, definitively shattering the Chrysler record. Even the iconic mooring mast on top, originally intended to be a dock for dirigibles, a concept that proved wildly impractical, served its purpose to extend the total height and ensure the building could never be surpassed by its rivals. The price of glory. The Empire State Building was a magnificent triumph of engineering, but a tragic victory of timing. It opened on the heels of the 1929 stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. With no businesses able to afford the enormous rent, the tower remained largely empty for years. The world's tallest building became a monument to economic collapse, tragically nicknamed the Empty State Building. Yet, in its emptiness, it cemented its place as the definitive icon of the American dream, a symbol of hope and defiance against despair. For decades, it would define the New York skyline, a tapered, regal spire built during the most frenzied and then the most devastating decade in American history.
The city of tomorrow, built today. The Empire State Building stood as a sentinel over the darkest economic period in American history. As the nation slowly pulled itself out of the Great Depression and then mobilized for World War II, the age of individual tycoons building monuments to themselves was over. The skyscraper would no longer be a gilded trophy. It would become a streamlined, functional tool of the emerging global corporation. This transition marked a seismic shift in New York's architectural soul. The ornate stone-clad setback style of the 1920s was replaced by the clean, severe, and radically transparent aesthetic of modernism. While the Empire State Building was struggling for tenants, another project, far more integrated and visionary, was taking shape: Rockefeller Center. This wasn't a single tower, but a massive 19-building complex built over 22 acres of prime midtown land. It was a model of integrated urban planning, conceived by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and designed by a team of architects in the late 1930s. Rockefeller Center was a city within a city. It successfully married commercial office space with public plazas, underground concourses, retail, and theaters. Its most famous building, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, 30 Rock, while imposing, sat comfortably within a larger, deliberate plan for open space and pedestrian flow. The complex proved that immense scale could coexist with public access and aesthetic coherence, a lesson New York desperately needed to learn. It wasn't the tallest, but it was the smartest piece of city building of its time, providing a template for large-scale development for the next 50 years. The glass box revolution. After World War II, America's economic machine roared back to life, establishing New York as the undisputed financial capital of the world. Global business demanded office space that was cheap, quick to build, and highly efficient. The old Art Deco towers, with their expensive stone cladding and inefficient tapering floors, were suddenly obsolete. The new mandate came from the international style, a movement transplanted to America which advocated for a rejection of all historical ornamentation. The philosophy was form follows function, and the preferred materials were glass, steel, and concrete. The ultimate expression of this movement arrived in two seminal midtown buildings that fundamentally reset the skyline. The first was Lever House, a slender, luminous blue-green glass box set atop a two-story base built by the soap manufacturer Lever Brothers. Its architect, Gordon Burnshaft, didn't build right up to the lot line. Instead, he raised the tower on pilotis, or stilts, and dedicated almost the entire ground floor to an open, public plaza. This was an unprecedented act in land-hungry Manhattan. The idea was perfected by the Seagram Building, designed by the masters of modernism, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. This structure, a pure bronze and smoked glass monolith, was perfection in corporate form. It stood back 100 feet from Park Avenue, creating a vast, shimmering granite plaza, a deliberate, expensive gesture of restraint and power by the Seagram Liquor dynasty. These buildings established the new rule. The office tower was to be an elegant, severe rectangular prism, a glass box. The new zoning paradigm, public space for private height. The massive growth in Midtown during the 1950s led city planners to overhaul the 1916 zoning resolution. The result was the 1961 zoning resolution, the most influential law since its predecessor. It recognized that the new international-style towers, if built flush against the street, would be just as dark and dreary as the old Equitable Building. The city's solution was incentive zoning. To encourage developers to incorporate public space, the law offered them a crucial trade. If a developer set their tower back and created a plaza, an arcade, or other publicly accessible space, the city would grant them a floor area bonus, allowing them to build their tower significantly taller than regulations would normally permit. This law sculpted the second half of the 20th century skyline. It led to the creation of dozens of wide, but often windswept and sterile plazas throughout Midtown. It was a deal with the devil. Sacrifice street-level vitality for increased height and light. This new regulation set the stage for the next, most monumental phase of the skyscraper story, the battle for absolute scale. The audacity of scale. The Twin Peaks. By the 1960s, Lower Manhattan's financial district had become stagnant, overshadowed by the gleaming glass and steel of Midtown. David Rockefeller, the driving force behind the new One Chase Manhattan Plaza Tower, insisted that downtown needed a symbol, an engine to reclaim its dominance. His vision was a colossal World Trade Center. The project was monumental in ambition and political complexity. Spearheaded by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the WTC was meant to be the largest building project in human history. To clear the 16-acre site, they used eminent domain to displace hundreds of businesses in what was known as Radio Row. The controversy was fierce, pitting state agency power against local business owners. Japanese-American architect Minoru Yamasaki was tasked with the design. He famously hated the idea of a single colossal tower, finding it arrogant. He offered the Port Authority a compromise. 2 enormous towers, simple, pure, and clean. The engineering required true genius. The site sat on waterlogged landfill, necessitating the creation of a bathtub, a massive 70-foot deep slurry wall perimeter built down to the bedrock to hold back the Hudson River. This allowed the central area to be excavated. The structural design was revolutionary. Instead of a thick internal core holding the load, like the Empire State, the Twin Towers featured a dense grid of exterior steel columns, the load-bearing perimeter, and a massive central core. This innovative system allowed for vast, column-free office floors. When completed in 1973, the Twin Towers soared to 1,368 and 1,362 feet, becoming the tallest buildings in the world. They were an ultimate declaration. New York's ambition was now planetary in scale. The postmodern interlude and the global market. The purity of the international style began to bore architects and critics. In the late 1970s, a movement called postmodernism emerged, which dared to put ornamentation, color, and historical reference back onto the skyscraper. The most famous example was Philip Johnson's AT&T Building, 1984, later the Sony Tower, in Midtown. It was clad in pink granite, featured arches, and was most famously topped with a gigantic, ornate broken pediment, or Chippendale top, a clear architectural joke that referenced 18th century furniture. The skyscraper was once again allowed to have fun, to reference history, and to be visually theatrical. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Skyline continued to densify, driven by massive corporate mergers and the rise of Wall Street as a global finance behemoth. Buildings were designed less for beauty and more for total square footage, marking an era where the skyscraper was purely a vessel for the bottom line. The unthinkable gap and the rebirth. The early 21st century brought an existential crisis to the Skyline. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 were not merely an attack on 2 buildings. They were an assault on the very symbol of American modernity and global commerce. The instantaneous collapse of the Twin Towers, buildings that were supposed to be structurally eternal, was a psychological and engineering shockwave. The rebuilding of the World Trade Center site became the greatest architectural and emotional challenge of the new millennium. The resulting design for One World Trade Center 2014 was deeply symbolic. Architect David Childs created a powerful structure anchored by a robust, secure base that rises to a perfect square at the roofline, the exact dimensions of the original towers. Its spire, which was crucial to securing its symbolic height, rose to a final, profound measure, 1,776 feet, referencing the year of the Declaration of Independence. One World Trade Center was not just an office tower, it was an act of civic defiance and a permanent memorial, standing as the ultimate symbol of New York's enduring resilience. The super talls. The Billionaire's Row. The final chapter of this century-long story is the rise of the current, hyper-engineered giants. Since 2010, the Skyline has undergone its most dramatic transformation since the 1930s, with the rise of the super talls and Billionaire's Row along 57th Street. Buildings like 432 Park Avenue and the Central Park Tower are not built primarily for commercial office space, but for luxury residential units catering to the ultra-wealthy. They are engineering marvels, able to be constructed impossibly slender due to complex structural engineering, specialized concrete, and sophisticated wind dampening systems. The Central Park Tower, at 1,550 feet, is now the tallest residential building in the world and the tallest in the Western Hemisphere by roof height. These towers dominate the Midtown skyline, casting long, controversial shadows over Central Park. The architectural revolution that began with a safety brake and a steel beam is now defined by a new question. Is the skyscraper still a powerful symbol of democratic capitalism and civic ambition? Or is it now simply a magnificent, exclusive vehicle for global capital? The New York skyline continues its rise, a testament to a century of vertical ambition, always changing, always challenging the limits of engineering, and forever casting a monumental shadow over the city and the world.